The echo of that day will forever haunt the chambers of my memory. My own mother-in-law, Margaret, her face a mask of chilling fury, accused my sweet Sophie of thievery. Before I could utter a syllable, she had lunged, her fingers tangling in Sophie's blonde curls, yanking with such force that a raw scream was torn from my daughter's throat. Sophie was flung to the polished oak floor as if she were a rag doll. Then, with a terrifying swiftness that belied her age, Margaret snatched up an old, scarred baseball bat from the corner and, with a guttural cry, brought it down. The sickening thud resonated through me, a sound that fractured our world into a million irreparable pieces as my husband, Ethan, and I watched, paralyzed by horror. My name is Eleanor Vance, though most call me Ellie. I'm 36. Life in Bridger City, Montana, had always felt like a well-worn, comfortable sweater, peaceful, fulfilling, shared with my husband, Ethan, and our precious 10-year-old daughter, Sophie. Our little clapboard house on Cedar Street was a sanctuary of love, warmth, and the constant, joyful chaos Sophie brought into our lives. She was our sunshine, endlessly curious, sharp as a tack, with an imagination that could conjure entire kingdoms from dust bunnies. Whether she was meticulously cataloging the wildflowers in our yard or spinning tales of adventurous squirrels, her spirit was a vibrant, untamed thing. Ethan and I had always nurtured Sophie's inquisitive nature, firm in our belief that childhood should be a haven safe, loved, and boundless. We'd striven to give her a life untouched by fear or profound sorrow. Yet, our family tapestry wasn't without its frayed threads. The most significant was my relationship with Ethan's mother, Margaret Holloway. A woman forged from granite and ice, Margaret was stern, exacting, and possessed an unyielding need for control. Ethan had gently warned me, even before our wedding vows, that his mother was formidable. Over the decade, I'd navigated our interactions with careful diplomacy, primarily for Ethan's peace of mind. Despite her abrasive exterior, I'd never truly perceived Margaret as a danger. Difficult, yes. Emotionally barricaded, certainly. But not a menace. I was catastrophically mistaken. The events of one sun-drenched Tuesday afternoon irrevocably altered that perception, shattering the fragile truce between us into dust. We'd decided to visit Margaret. Since Ethan's father passed some years ago, she lived alone in the sprawling ranch-style house on the outskirts of town. She'd never overtly expressed loneliness, but I sensed she cherished our visits, particularly the moments with Sophie. For all her rigidity, I'd always believed Margaret harbored a soft spot for her only grandchild. Or so I'd convinced myself. Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement for this visit. That morning, exploring the creek bed behind our house, she'd unearthed a treasure she couldn't wait to share, a perfectly intact robin's egg, its delicate blue shell unmarred. She cradled it reverently in a small, cotton-lined jewelry box, eager to present her find. As we drove towards Margaret's, Sophie, buckled in the back, held up the box. "Mama, d'you think Grandma Addie has ever seen such a perfect egg?" she'd chirped, her eyes wide. I'd smiled at her reflection in the rearview mirror. "I'm sure she has, Poppet, but she'll adore hearing how you found it." Beside me, Ethan offered a small, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of Sophie's innocent charm. When we pulled into Margaret's gravel driveway, everything felt utterly ordinary. The house was still, a faint aroma of baked apples hanging in the air, a classical concerto drifting softly from an unseen radio. Margaret greeted us at the door, her tone clipped, her expression, as always, difficult to decipher. Yet, when her gaze fell upon Sophie, a flicker almost imperceptible, but there of something akin to affection, softened her steely eyes. "Come in," she said, her voice carrying its customary formality, stepping aside. "Good of you to make the drive." Even in its stiffness, I sensed a genuine, if muted, pleasure at seeing Sophie. As we entered, Sophie, ever enthusiastic, darted towards the sunroom, keen to find a safe spot for her robin's egg before unveiling it. Meanwhile, Ethan and I offered to help Margaret with a few small tasks she'd mentioned over the phone. The afternoon felt placid, a routine visit, indistinguishable from countless others. I had no premonition, no inkling, that this seemingly benign day was about to veer into a nightmare that would forever scar our family. The afternoon ambled on peacefully. Ethan and I kept busy, he tightening a loose banister on the back porch, I helping Margaret sort through some old linens. Sophie, having carefully placed her treasure on a sun-drenched windowsill, was now engrossed in exploring the contents of an antique roll-top desk in the den. She'd always been a little explorer, and the promise of forgotten trinkets in unfamiliar drawers was an irresistible lure. As I folded a freshly laundered tablecloth in the kitchen, I could hear her soft hums and occasional whispered exclamations. It was a familiar, comforting soundtrack to her innocent discoveries. I smiled, musing on her innate ability to find magic in the mundane. Then, cutting through the quiet hum of the house, Sophie's voice, bright with discovery. "Mama, look what I found." Intrigued, I walked from the kitchen into the den. Sophie stood by the desk, holding a crisp $100 bill. Her face was alight with the thrill of an unexpected find. "I think it was tucked inside this old ledger," she explained, pointing to a leather-bound book on the desk's surface. "Maybe Grandma Addie forgot about it." I opened my mouth to suggest we give it to Margaret, but before a sound could escape, a voice, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the tranquil air. "What in God's name do you think you're doing with that?" Margaret's voice, laced with venom, made my heart seize. Ethan, who had just come in from the porch, appeared in the doorway, his expression instantly alarmed. Sophie froze, her eyes vast pools of shock. Margaret stormed into the den, her face contorted with a terrifying rage, and snatched the bill from Sophie's small hand. "You thieving little brat." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "Is this how you've been raised? To steal from your own grandmother?" Sophie's lower lip trembled, her hands fluttering uselessly. "No, Grandma Addie, I wasn't stealing. I just found it. I was going to show Mama." But Margaret was beyond reason, her fury a runaway train. As I stared into her glacial eyes, a cold dread coiled in my stomach. This was more than anger. This was something dark and unhinged. The room plunged into a suffocating silence. Sophie stood rooted to the spot, tears welling, threatening to spill. Ethan and I were momentarily stunned, struggling to comprehend the ferocity of Margaret's outburst. Then, before I could react, before I could bridge the space between us, Margaret lunged. She grabbed Sophie by her hair, a fistful of golden strands. A piercing, agonized scream tore from Sophie's lips as Margaret yanked her backward with brutal force. Sophie's small body contorted, her hands flying to her head, desperately trying to dislodge her grandmother's vice-like grip. "Margaret, stop it!" I shrieked, my voice raw with panic, surging forward. "You deceitful little thief!" Margaret's voice was a low hiss, her face inches from Sophie's, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tightened her grip, pulling harder. Tears streamed down Sophie's terror-stricken face. "Grandma, please. I didn't steal." "I promise," she sobbed, her voice fracturing. Ethan moved with lightning speed, wedging himself between them. He seized Margaret's arm, his grip unyielding, prying her away from our daughter. "Let her go, Mother." "What in the hell are you doing?" For a fleeting second, Margaret faltered, her chest heaving. But then, her wild eyes landed on an old Louisville slugger Ethan's from his Little League days leaning against the fireplace, forgotten for years. Before any of us could process her intent, she lunged for it. "No!" I screamed, a desperate, futile sound. It was too late. With a terrifying, explosive power, Margaret swung the bat. The sickening crack of wood connecting with bone echoed in the den. Sophie collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Time seemed to warp, to slow to a crawl. I saw her small form crumple to the floor, limbs askew, her breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. A crimson stain began to blossom on her temple, matting her soft hair. Her eyelids fluttered weakly, dazed, uncomprehending. Sophie. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands shaking so violently I could barely function as I cradled her head. My vision swam with tears, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Ethan's face was a canvas of disbelief and raw horror. He turned on Margaret, his voice a guttural roar. "What have you done?" "She's just a child." Margaret stood panting, the bat still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. For a chilling moment, no remorse, only a cold, unyielding fury, stared back from her eyes. I pressed trembling fingers to Sophie's neck. A pulse, faint, thready, but there. "We have to get her to the hospital." "No." I choked out, the words barely intelligible through my panic. Ethan didn't hesitate. He scooped Sophie into his arms, her limp body cradled against his chest. Without a backward glance, we fled, leaving Margaret standing alone in the sun-dappled den, the instrument of her violence still in her hand. As we tore down the driveway, gravel spitting from beneath the tires, I twisted in my seat to look at my daughter. Her face was a ghastly white, her breathing terrifyingly shallow. I could barely hear my own voice as I whispered, "Hang on, baby, please, just hang on." Ethan drove like a man possessed, his knuckles stark white against the steering wheel. The car devoured the miles to Bridger City General, weaving through traffic. I sat in the back, cradling Sophie, pressing a wad of napkins from my purse to the gash on her head, a desperate, inadequate attempt to staunch the bleeding. "Sophie, sweetie, stay with me. Open your eyes for Mama," I pleaded, my voice cracking. Her body was terrifyingly still, her breathing a mere flutter. Every few moments, her eyelids would flicker, a soft, pained moan escaping her lips. She was slipping away. "Ethan, hurry!" I cried, sheer terror clawing at my throat. "I'm going as fast as I can, Ellie." Ethan's voice was strained, filled with a desperate urgency. He ran a red light, the blare of angry horns a distant, irrelevant noise. I looked down at Sophie's small, ashen face, my hands trembling as I stroked her blood-matted hair. I had never known fear like this, a cold, suffocating dread that threatened to consume me. "This isn't happening," I chanted silently, a futile mantra against the encroaching horror. "This can't be real." By the time we screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance, Ethan was already out, yanking open the back door. He lifted Sophie gently but swiftly, her fragile body limp in his arms. "Help! Somebody please help us," he bellowed as we burst through the automatic doors. The organized chaos of the ER converged on us. A team of doctors and nurses rushed forward, taking Sophie from Ethan's embrace, laying her on a gurney. She was hit in the head. She lost consciousness. "She's barely breathing," I sobbed, clutching a nurse's arm. "Trauma 1, now," a doctor commanded, already wheeling the gurney down a brightly lit corridor. I tried to follow, but a nurse gently restrained me. "Please, ma'am, we need room to work," she said, her eyes kind but firm. I watched, helpless, as they disappeared with my daughter behind a set of swinging doors. And, just like that, she was gone. A strangled sob tore from my throat, my legs threatening to buckle. Ethan was there, his arms a steel band around me as I collapsed against his chest, his own body trembling. "We never should have gone," he muttered, his voice hollow with self-recrimination. "I should have known. I should never have let her near my mother." Tears burned my eyes as I whispered fiercely, "She needs to be arrested, Ethan. Margaret has to pay for this." He nodded slowly, his face a grim landscape of rage and devastation. "Then, let's make that call." The waiting room was sterile and cold, the silence broken only by the frantic rhythm of my own breathing. My arms ached with an empty longing for Sophie. The pervasive scent of antiseptic stung my nostrils, making my stomach roil. Time stretched, became elastic, each tick of the institutional clock an eternity. Ethan and I sat side by side, a chasm of unspeakable grief between us. We stared at the closed doors of the trauma unit, a silent, desperate vigil. I gripped Ethan's hand, my knuckles white, but he didn't flinch, his grasp a lifeline in the terrifying darkness. Finally, after an age, a doctor in blue scrubs emerged. He looked weary but composed, and I clung to that small shred of hope as I forced myself to my feet. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance?" His voice was calm, professional. "Yes," I managed, my voice a dry croak. "How is she? Is she okay?" The doctor offered a small, reassuring nod. "She's stable for now." The blow to her head caused a significant concussion and a deep laceration. Miraculously, there's no skull fracture. We've controlled the bleeding and sutured the wound. However, there is some mild cerebral edema swelling in the brain, so we need to monitor her closely for at least the next 24 to 48 hours. She's regained consciousness, but she's very weak and disoriented. A wave of relief, so potent it nearly buckled my knees, washed over me, yet it couldn't extinguish the embers of rage still glowing in my core. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "Can we see her?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor nodded. "Of course. But please, keep it brief. She needs a great deal of rest." We practically ran down the corridor to Sophie's room. The sight that greeted us cleaved my heart anew. Sophie lay on the stark white hospital bed, looking impossibly small and fragile, her head swathed in bandages. Her face was pale, her eyelids heavy. In 4 lines snaked into her small arm, the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only sound in the hushed room. I rushed to her side, gently stroking the hair back from her face. "Sophie, sweetheart," I whispered. She turned her head slowly, her lips parting. "Mama?" Her voice was a hoarse, faint whisper. "I'm here, baby," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "You're safe now." Ethan sat on the other side of the bed, his large hand enveloping hers. "We love you so much, Sophie girl. You're so brave." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. "I didn't steal the money," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Grandma Addie, she was so mad." A fresh wave of fury surged through me. I clenched my fists, my nails biting into my palms. "I know, Poppet," I said softly. "I know. And she is never, ever going to hurt you again." Ethan met my gaze, and in that instant, an unspoken pact was forged. We would not let this go. I stood, my body trembling with a potent cocktail of adrenaline and resolve. "I'm calling the police." I stepped out of Sophie's room, every nerve ending alight with a cold, hard rage and an unshakable determination. Ethan was right behind me, his jaw set, his eyes like chips of flint. We found a charge nurse who directed us to a small office where hospital security could contact the Bridger City Police Department. Within minutes, a uniformed officer, Miller, arrived. He was a tall, rangy man with kind eyes that held a no-nonsense glint. His notepad was already open. "You're Sophie Vance's parents?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Yes," I said, my throat tight. "We need to file a report. We want to press charges." "All right," Officer Miller said, his pen poised. "Tell me exactly what happened." I took a steadying breath, forcing myself to recount the nightmare. We were visiting my husband's mother, Margaret Holloway. My daughter, Sophie, found a $100 bill in an old desk. She wasn't stealing it. She was just excited by the find. But when Margaret saw her with it, my voice faltered, but I pushed on. She lost her mind. She grabbed Sophie by the hair, screamed at her. When Sophie tried to explain, Margaret, she hit her. With a baseball bat. On the head. Officer Miller's pen stilled. He looked up sharply. "She struck your daughter with a baseball bat?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed, his voice a low rumble of contained fury. Sophie collapsed. She was bleeding. "We brought her straight here." Officer Miller let out a slow breath and nodded. "That's aggravated assault." Do you have any prior history of concern with Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Vance? Ethan shook his head, his fists clenching. She's always been difficult. But we never imagined. Never anything like this. If I'd had any idea, I'd never have taken Sophie there. The officer made a few more notes, then glanced towards the pediatric wing. May I see Sophie with your permission? I hesitated, then nodded. She's weak, but she's awake. He followed us to Sophie's room. The sight of her, small and pale, hooked up to machines, her head bandaged, fueled my anger. Officer Miller knelt by her bed, his voice gentle. Hey there, Sophie. I'm Officer Miller. I'm here to make sure you're safe. Sophie's lips trembled. Grandma Addie was really mad, she whispered. She called me a thief. But I didn't take her money. I know, sweetheart, I murmured, smoothing her hair. The officer nodded and stood. That's all I need for now. I don't want to tire her. He turned to us, his expression grave. With your statements and the preliminary medical report, we have probable cause to arrest Margaret Holloway immediately. Ethan released a ragged breath. What happens now? Officer Miller straightened. Now we go find her and bring her in. As soon as Officer Miller left the hospital, he radioed his dispatch, requesting a unit to proceed to Margaret Holloway's residence for an arrest on charges of aggravated assault and child endangerment. Ethan and I stayed by Sophie's side, but my mind was replaying the scene at Margaret's, now imagining the arrival of the police. About an hour later, Ethan's cell phone rang. It was Officer Miller. Ethan put it on speaker. We've made contact with Margaret Holloway at her home, Miller stated. We're about to take her into custody. My heart hammered against my ribs. Did she resist? I asked. She answered the door, Miller said. Seems surprised, almost indignant. Like she doesn't believe she's done anything wrong. Of course, she doesn't, I thought bitterly. Margaret always believed herself to be in the right. Do you want to remain on the line while we execute the arrest? Miller asked. Yes, Ethan said, his voice firm. Over the speaker, we heard muffled voices, the crunch of gravel, then a sharp rap on a door. Margaret Holloway, this is the Bridger City Police. We have a warrant for your arrest. Please open the door. A beat of silence, then Margaret's unmistakable, imperious voice. A warrant? For what, pray tell? Ma'am, you are under arrest for the aggravated assault of a minor, your granddaughter, Sophie Vance. Please step outside with your hands visible. Margaret let out a sound that was half scoff, half outrage. You can't be serious. That child needed a firm hand, not mollycoddling. Hearing her dismissive words, a fresh wave of nausea washed over me. We're not going to ask again, ma'am. Officer Miller's voice was steady. Step outside now. More indistinct sounds. Then, a moment later, the distinct, metallic click-clack of handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. An officer began reciting the Miranda warning. Margaret's voice, now laced with genuine disbelief and fury, cut through. You're arresting me? For doing what her parents are too weak to do? That girl needed to learn a lesson about respecting other people's property. Ethan's jaw was granite. I could see the muscle pulsing. She's not your property, you vile woman, I whispered, too low for the phone to pick up. And she didn't deserve to be brutalized over a forgotten $100 bill. The call ended. I pictured Margaret, cuffed, still spewing her self-righteous justifications. I looked at Ethan, exhaling slowly. They have her. He nodded, his shoulders still rigid. It's not over, Ellie. We have to make sure she stays locked up. We both knew the battle had just begun. Several weeks later, the day of Margaret Holloway's trial arrived. She faced charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and felony child endangerment. The case had stirred considerable interest in Bridger City, and the small county courtroom was filled to capacity with local reporters, concerned community members, and a few distant relatives, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. I sat in the front row, Ethan's hand a reassuring pressure on mine. My heart thrummed a nervous rhythm against my ribs as I glanced at Sophie, nestled between us. Her physical wounds had mostly healed, a pale scar hidden beneath her hairline, but the invisible ones, the emotional lacerations, were still tender. Nightmares still stalked her sleep, and though she tried to be brave, I knew she was terrified. Then, they brought Margaret in. She wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed before her. For the first time I could recall, she didn't look imposing. She looked diminished, bitter, yet her cold eyes, sweeping the room, still held a spark of defiance as they settled on Ethan and me. There was no remorse, only a faint, contemptuous curl of her lip. She still didn't believe she'd done anything wrong. The judge entered, and the trial commenced. The county prosecutor, a young, earnest woman named Miss Albright, rose to deliver her opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because of an act of unspeakable cruelty, an act perpetrated by a grandmother, a figure who should embody love and protection against her own 10-year-old granddaughter. In a fit of unprovoked rage, she accused the child of theft, violently assaulted her, and then, with chilling deliberation, struck her with a baseball bat. Were it not for the swift actions of her parents, Sophie Vance might not be with us today. We are here to ensure that Margaret Holloway is held accountable. Margaret's public defender attempted to paint her actions as a misguided attempt at discipline, arguing she never intended serious harm. But then Miss Albright played the 911 call Ethan had made that afternoon. The courtroom fell into a hushed stillness as Ethan's frantic, desperate voice filled the space. My daughter, my mother hit her. She's bleeding, unconscious. Please send an ambulance. Sophie's soft, pained moans were audible in the background, a heartbreaking counterpoint to Ethan's panic. Tears pricked my eyes. Next, the ER doctor who had treated Sophie took the stand, detailing the extent of her injuries. This was no accident, the doctor stated unequivocally. The force of the impact was significant. It could easily have resulted in permanent brain damage or worse. Sophie Vance is a very lucky little girl. A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. Then, it was Sophie's turn. I squeezed her hand reassuringly as she rose, her small figure looking even more diminutive under the solemn gaze of the court. She walked to the witness stand, her legs barely reaching the floor as she perched on the edge of the large chair. The judge spoke to her kindly, his voice gentle. Ms. Albright approached. Sophie, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day at your Grandma Addie's house? Sophie's lip trembled, but she took a small, shaky breath. I found some money in Grandma Addie's desk, she whispered, her voice small but clear in the silent room. I was going to give it back. But when she saw me, she got real mad. She pulled my hair. It hurt a lot. Several jurors exchanged disturbed glances. And then what happened, Sophie? Miss Albright prompted gently. Sophie blinked, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She hit me with Ethan's old baseball bat. And then I woke up in the hospital. A collective gasp, a wave of hushed whispers. Some jurors looked visibly distressed. Margaret sat impassive, refusing to even look at her granddaughter. Thank you, Sophie, Ms. Albright said softly. You were very brave. Sophie returned to us, and I pulled her into a fierce hug, whispering how proud I was. After the presentation of further evidence, the police report, photographs of Sophie's injuries, the baseball bat itself, the prosecution rested. Margaret Holloway elected to testify in her own defense. She stood, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. I did what any responsible grandparent would do. Children these days are coddled, undisciplined. If my son and his wife weren't so permissive, I wouldn't have had to intervene to teach that girl a lesson about honesty. Audible gasps filled the courtroom. Even the judge's expression hardened. With that single, callous statement, Margaret had sealed her own fate. The jury's deliberation was swift. Less than an hour later, they returned. The foreman, a stern-faced rancher, stood. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, we, the jury, find the defendant, Margaret Holloway, guilty. On the charge of felony child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. I let out a shuddering breath I hadn't realized I was holding, tears finally streaming down my face. Ethan closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping in profound relief. The judge nodded grimly. Margaret Holloway, for these egregious crimes against your own grandchild, this court sentences you to 12 years in the Montana State Women's Prison. You will be eligible for parole consideration after serving a minimum of 8 years. It was done. Margaret's composure finally cracked. The stark reality of her future seemed to crash down upon her as the bailiff approached. As the handcuffs were secured, she turned, her eyes blazing, locking onto Ethan. You did this to me, she spat, her voice venomous. Your own mother. Ethan's expression was unyielding. No, mother, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You did this to yourself. As Margaret was led away, I pulled Sophie close, burying my face in her hair, inhaling the sweet scent of her. The nightmare, at long last, was over. The trial's conclusion brought a measure of justice, but the emotional debris of Margaret's actions still littered our lives. Though the legal battle was won, the scars she'd inflicted both seen and unseen would require far more time to mend. Leaving the courthouse, Ethan, Sophie, and I drove home in a strangely subdued silence. Our little house on Cedar Street felt different, the air still heavy with the phantom limb of trauma. Yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of lightness, a sense that we could finally begin to draw a full breath. That evening, I sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, gently brushing her hair as she clutched her worn teddy bear, Barnaby, her constant companion since the hospital. Mama, she whispered, her eyes finding mine in the dim light of her nightlight. Yes, Poppet, I replied softly. Grandma Addie, she's really gone away now, right? Her voice was tentative, tinged with a hopeful fear. I nodded, my heart aching with a fierce, protective love. Yes, sweetheart. She is. She can't hurt you anymore. Sophie let out a slow, quiet sigh and snuggled deeper under her covers, her eyes fluttering closed. Good, she murmured. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she drifted into a peaceful, untroubled sleep. In the ensuing months, our lives became a quiet rhythm of healing. We found a wonderful child therapist for Sophie, a kind woman with a gentle smile who helped her navigate the labyrinth of her fears, coaxing out the nightmares and rebuilding her shattered sense of security. The initial sessions were difficult. Sophie was often withdrawn, her words scarce. But slowly, painstakingly, she began to open up. Ethan and I sought counseling too, grappling with our own guilt, anger, and the lingering shock. We had, however unintentionally, exposed Sophie to danger. Therapy helped us process that we had also done the most important thing. We had protected her fiercely when it mattered most. Our focus shifted to reclaiming our home as a sanctuary. We redecorated Sophie's room together, letting her choose vibrant paints and whimsical decals. We instituted new family traditions, elaborate Saturday morning pancake breakfasts, impromptu camping trips in the living room, starlit evenings on the porch identifying constellations. Gradually, Sophie's laughter, that bright, infectious sound, began to fill our home once more. Her innate curiosity, her boundless enthusiasm for life, slowly reemerged, like spring blossoms after a harsh winter. One crisp autumn afternoon, I watched from the kitchen window as Sophie, her laughter echoing through the golden leaves, raced across the backyard with a neighborhood friend, their hands outstretched, chasing the last of the season's butterflies. Ethan came to stand beside me, his arm slipping around my waist, a quiet smile playing on his lips. For the first time in a very long time, a profound sense of peace settled over us. I reached for his hand, my fingers twining with his. We did the right thing, Ethan, I whispered. He nodded, his gaze soft with an enduring love. We always will, Ellie. For her. And in that quiet moment, I knew. Our family, though irrevocably changed, was whole again. Whatever the future held, whatever new challenges life might present, we would face them together. Because love, fierce and unwavering, and the sanctuary of family were infinitely stronger than fear.